The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Clearwater Springs as the church bell chimed noon. Sheriff Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his weathered brow and adjusted his hat, watching the heat waves dance above the wooden boardwalks. The town was unusually quiet for a Saturday, with most folks seeking shade in the saloon or general store. A lone figure approached from the eastern trail, walking steadily despite the oppressive heat. As the stranger drew closer, Morrison squinted and leaned forward in his chair outside the sheriff's office. The man was clearly Apache, his bronze skin, black hair braided with leather strips, and traditional buckskin clothing left no doubt about his heritage, but something was unusual about him. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered Ezra Collins, the blacksmith, who had stopped his work to peer down the street. "Look at the size of that one." The Apache man stood barely over 4 feet tall, his frame compact but well-proportioned. Despite his small stature, he carried himself with unmistakable dignity, his shoulders straight and his dark eyes alert as they surveyed the town. He wore finely crafted moccasins and a buckskin shirt decorated with intricate beadwork that spoke of considerable skill and status within his tribe. Word spread quickly through Clearwater Springs, and curious residents began emerging from buildings like prairie dogs from their holes. By the time the small Apache reached the center of town, a crowd had gathered. Ranchers, shopkeepers, their wives and children, all staring with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed amusement. "Looky there, boys," called out Buck Sanders, a cattle rancher known for his crude humor. "The Apache sent us their runt." His comment drew snickers from several men lounging outside Murphy's saloon. The Apache stopped in front of the sheriff's office, his expression remaining calm and dignified despite the gathering crowd's obvious mockery. He raised his right hand in a gesture of peace. "I am Ayana of the Chiricahua Apache," he said in clear, accented English. His voice, though soft-spoken, carried surprising authority. "I come seeking words with your leaders about the treaty boundaries near Copper Canyon." Sheriff Morrison stood up slowly, his hand instinctively resting on his gun belt. At 35, he'd seen enough Indian conflicts to be wary, but this small figure hardly seemed threatening. If anything, he looked more like a boy playing dress-up than a legitimate Apache representative. "Son, you sure you're in the right place?" Morrison asked with a condescending chuckle. "Seems to me the Apache would send a full-grown warrior for such important business, not—" He gestured vaguely at Ayana's diminutive frame. "Maybe he's their mascot," suggested Widow Henderson from across the street, causing her friend to burst into giggles. Ayana's jaw tightened slightly, but his composure never wavered. "The matter I bring requires wisdom, not size. My people wish to discuss the recent encroachment of cattle onto our sacred burial grounds near the spring." "Listen here, little fella," interrupted Mayor Thomas Hartwell, who had emerged from the bank upon hearing the commotion. A portly man with an impressive mustache, he looked down at Ayana with obvious disdain. "I don't know what kind of game your people are playing, but if they want to discuss serious matters with serious men, they'd better send someone we can take seriously." The crowd murmured approval of their mayor's words. Several men nodded, crossing their arms as they studied the small Apache with skeptical eyes. "Perhaps," Ayana replied evenly, "you judge too quickly what makes a man worthy of serious words. The eagle does not need the size of the buffalo to soar above them both." "Well, ain't that just precious?" sneered Buck Sanders. "The little Indian's got himself some fancy sayings. Tell you what, boy, why don't you run on home and tell the real Apache that if they want to palaver with us, they can send someone who can actually reach the negotiating table without standing on a chair." Laughter rippled through the crowd, harsh and mocking. Even some of the women tittered behind their hands while children pointed and whispered to each other about the tiny Indian man. Ayana's dark eyes swept the crowd, taking in each face, memorizing the expressions of contempt and amusement. When he spoke again, his voice remained steady, though those paying close attention might have noticed the subtle steel that had crept into his tone. "I have traveled 3 days through the desert to bring peaceful words to this place. The message I carry concerns the lives of both our peoples. Will you hear it, or will you let pride and foolishness guide your choices?" Sheriff Morrison exchanged glances with Mayor Hartwell, both men clearly struggling not to laugh outright. The idea that this diminutive figure could represent any real authority among the Apache seemed absurd. "Look, son," Morrison said, adopting the tone one might use with a confused child, "I'm sure you mean well, but grown men don't conduct business with—" He paused, searching for a diplomatic word. Well, with someone who looks like he should be playing with wooden ponies instead of discussing treaties. The insult hung in the hot desert air like smoke. Ayana stood perfectly still for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The crowd fell silent, sensing that something significant had just occurred, though they couldn't quite identify what. Finally, Ayana nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. I see. Then perhaps it is not yet time for the words I carry. But know this, the disrespect shown here today will be remembered. The consequences of refusing to listen may prove educational. With that cryptic statement, he turned and began walking back toward the eastern trail, his small but proud figure quickly becoming a distant speck against the shimmering horizon. Well, that was easy enough, chuckled Mayor Hartwell. Maybe now they'll send someone we can actually do business with. But Sheriff Morrison found himself watching the retreating figure with growing unease, wondering if they'd just made a terrible mistake. 3 days after Ayana's departure, the morning air in Clearwater Springs crackled with tension. Sheriff Morrison stood on the wooden boardwalk outside his office, squinting at the dust cloud approaching from the east. Even from a distance, he could make out the distinctive silhouettes of Apache warriors on horseback, at least 20 of them, riding in formation. Jesus Christ, muttered Deputy Williams, emerging from the jail with a cup of coffee that trembled in his nervous hands. That's more Apache than we've seen in these parts for years. The warriors rode with the fluid grace of men born in the saddle, their horses' hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth. As they drew closer, Morrison could see they were painted for war. White and red stripes across their faces, feathers in their hair, weapons clearly visible. At their head rode a man whose presence commanded immediate respect. Chief Naalnish sat tall and proud on his painted stallion, his weathered face bearing the dignity of his 53 years and the wisdom of countless battles. His long grey hair was adorned with eagle feathers, and a magnificent silver and turquoise necklace caught the morning sunlight. Unlike his warriors, his face bore no war paint, but his dark eyes held the cold intensity of a gathering storm. The Apache formation came to a halt just outside the town limits, close enough to be clearly seen, but far enough to avoid appearing immediately threatening. The chief rode forward alone, stopping his horse directly in front of the sheriff's office, where a nervous crowd had already begun to gather. I am Naalnish, chief of the Chiricahua Apache. His voice carried clearly across the silent street, speaking English with careful precision. 3 days ago, my son came to this place with words of peace. He was met with mockery and disrespect. Mayor Hartwell pushed through the crowd, his face flushed red with indignation. Now see here, Chief. We don't appreciate being intimidated by silence. The single word from Naalnish cut through the mayor's protest like a blade. The chief's gaze moved slowly across the assembled townspeople, taking in their fearful faces. You laughed at my son because of his size. You refused to hear his words because you judged him weak. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his hand hovering near his gun, but not quite touching it. Chief Naalnish, we meant no disrespect to you or your people, but surely you understand when someone comes claiming to represent the Apache nation, You expect what a white man looks like when he thinks of strength, Naalnish interrupted, his voice carrying a note of bitter amusement. You see only the outside, like children who judge a river's power by its width and not its depth. Mrs. Patterson, the schoolteacher, whispered nervously to her neighbor, I told my husband we shouldn't have been so quick to dismiss that young man. Something about him seemed different. Chief Naalnish continued, his words measured and deliberate. My son, Ayana, was born small in body. This is true. But the Great Spirit does not measure a man's worth by the inches of his height or the breadth of his shoulders. In our tribe, he is known as he who sees far because his wisdom reaches beyond what others can grasp. Buck Sanders, emboldened by liquid courage from his morning visit to Murphy's saloon, called out from the back of the crowd, Well, Chief, maybe if your boy had told us who he was instead of playing games. The chief's eyes locked onto Sanders with such intensity that the rancher's words died in his throat. My son told you his name. He spoke with respect and dignity. But you were too busy laughing to listen to what he said, or to ask who he was. Your ignorance is not his failing. Dr. Marcus Webb, the town physician and one of the few educated men in Clearwater Springs, stepped forward with a troubled expression. Chief Naalnish, please understand our perspective. In our culture, important negotiations are typically conducted by those who appear, well, more imposing. We didn't know he was your son. And why should that matter? Naalnish's question hung in the desert air like a challenge. Does a man's words carry less truth because his father is a farmer rather than a chief? Does wisdom become foolishness because it comes from unexpected lips? The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Several people exchanged glances, beginning to realize the magnitude of their error. The sacred burial grounds of our ancestors are being trampled by your cattle, the chief continued, his voice growing harder. The spring that has provided water for our ceremonies for countless generations is being fouled by your animals. My son came to speak of these things with peaceful words, hoping to find a solution that would honor both our peoples. Mayor Hartwell cleared his throat nervously. Chief, we had no idea about the significance of that area. Perhaps we can discuss— Now you wish to discuss? Naalnish's voice carried a dangerous edge. Now that you see warriors at your doorstep instead of one small man with peaceful intentions? This is how white men prefer their negotiations, with the threat of violence hanging over them like buzzards. Sheriff Morrison felt sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool morning air. Chief, we're willing to talk now. If there's been a misunderstanding— There has been no misunderstanding, Naalnish said firmly. You understood perfectly. You saw my son and decided he was not worthy of your time or respect. You judged him by your own shallow measures and found him wanting. But you were wrong. The chief raised his hand and one of his warriors rode forward, leading a second horse. The crowd watched in tense silence as the warrior dismounted and walked to his chief's side. This is my nephew, Takoda, Naalnish said, gesturing to the tall, powerfully built young man who stood beside his horse. He is strong in body, skilled with weapons, feared by our enemies. If I had sent him to speak with you, would you have listened? Several men in the crowd nodded unconsciously. But my son Ayana speaks 7 languages, has studied the laws of both our peoples, and can recite the history of every treaty made between Apache and white men for the past 50 years. He was the right choice for these talks, not because of who his father is, but because of who he is. The chief's words settled over the crowd like heavy stones. The realization of their mistake was becoming clear, and with it came the understanding that they might have jeopardized not just negotiations, but the fragile peace that had existed between the town and the Apache. Chief Naalnish, Doctor, Webb said carefully, if your son were willing to return, we would be honored to hear his words properly this time. The chief studied the physician for a long moment before responding. My son will decide for himself whether your town has earned the right to hear his words again. But know this, the disrespect shown to him was disrespect shown to all Apache. Some wrongs cannot be easily mended. With that warning hanging in the air like smoke, Chief Naalnish wheeled his horse around and rode back toward his warriors, leaving the townspeople to contemplate the gravity of their error and the uncertain future it had created. A week had passed since Chief Naalnish's warning, and the atmosphere in Clearwater Springs remained as tense as a drawn bowstring. Sheriff Morrison found himself checking the eastern horizon compulsively, while Mayor Hartwell had taken to pacing his office like a caged animal. The townspeople went about their daily business, with one eye always turned toward the desert, wondering when, or if, the Apache would return. Dr. Webb had spent considerable time researching Apache customs in his small library, trying to understand the magnitude of their mistake. What he'd learned had only deepened his concern. In Apache culture, to insult a chief's son was tantamount to insulting the entire tribe, and the consequences could be severe. It was Deputy Williams who first spotted the lone rider approaching from the east during the hot afternoon hours. Sheriff, he called out, his voice tight with anxiety. Someone's coming. Morrison stepped out into the blazing sun, shading his eyes with his hand. As the figure drew closer, his heart sank. It was Ayana, returning alone, just as he had come before. But this time something was different about his approach. He rode with the same quiet dignity, but there was a new gravity to his bearing that hadn't been there during his first visit. Word spread quickly through the town, and by the time Ayana reached the main street, a crowd had gathered once again. But the mood was markedly different from his first arrival. Gone were the smirks and barely suppressed laughter. In their place was an uncomfortable mixture of shame, curiosity, and fear. Ayana dismounted gracefully despite his small stature, tying his horse's reins to the hitching post with practiced efficiency. He wore the same traditional clothing as before, but now the townspeople noticed details they had missed. The exceptional quality of the beadwork, the silver ornaments that marked high status, the ceremonial knife at his belt that spoke of warrior training despite his size. I have returned, he said simply, his dark eyes scanning the assembled crowd. My father, Chief Naalnish, has given me permission to speak with you once more, despite the insults offered during my first visit. Mayor Hartwell stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment and genuine remorse. Son, Ayana, we owe you an apology. We didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't ask, Ayana interrupted, his voice calm but firm. You saw only what your eyes told you to see, not what was truly before you. Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. We've learned that you're Chief Naalnish's son. We had no idea. And would my words have carried more weight if you had known? Ayana asked, tilting his head slightly. Would the truth of what I came to say have been greater because of who my father is? The question hung in the air, unanswered but clearly heard. Dr. Webb stepped forward from the crowd, his expression thoughtful and troubled. No, he said quietly. The truth would have been the same. We should have listened to your words, not judged your appearance. That was our failing, not yours. Ayana nodded approvingly at the doctor. You speak with honesty. This gives me hope that we might yet find understanding. Buck Sanders, who had remained notably quiet since the chief's visit, shuffled forward with his hat in his hands. Look, I said some things that weren't right. About you, I mean. I'm sorry for that. Your words revealed the contents of your heart, Ayana replied, studying the rancher with penetrating eyes. But a man can choose to fill his heart with different things if he has the courage to change. Mrs. Patterson, the school teacher, spoke up from near the front of the crowd. What can we do to make this right? We've clearly wronged you and your people. Ayana was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority that the townspeople had been too blind to recognize before. I am Ayana, son of Chief Naalnish, keeper of the 7 sacred bundles, speaker of our laws, and guardian of our treaty rights. I have studied in the white man's schools in Santa Fe and learned your ways, not to become like you, but to better protect my people from misunderstandings and injustices. The crowd listened in stunned silence as the full weight of his credentials sank in. The burial grounds near Copper Canyon Spring have been sacred to the Chiricahua for over 300 years, he continued. The bones of our ancestors rest there, including my own grandmother and great-grandfather. Your cattle trample these graves and foul the water we use for our most sacred ceremonies. Mayor Hartwell swallowed hard. We had no idea. The ranchers were told it was open grazing land. By whom? Ayana asked sharply. Who told them this? The mayor's face grew pale. The Territorial Land Office in Tucson, they issued the grazing permits. Without consulting the Apache Nation, despite our treaty rights, Ayana said, his voice carrying an edge of controlled anger. This is not ignorance, this is deliberate disregard for agreements signed in good faith. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable. What do you propose we do about this? First, the cattle must be moved from the sacred grounds immediately, Ayana replied without hesitation. Second, the spring must be cleaned and restored. Third, we must establish clear boundaries that will prevent future violations. That sounds reasonable, Dr. Webb said, though several of the ranchers in the crowd looked less pleased with the demands. And fourth, Ayana continued, his voice growing harder, there must be compensation for the desecration that has already occurred. Compensation? Buck Sanders blurted out, then caught himself and looked down at his boots. Ayana's eyes fixed on the rancher. Would you allow someone to use your family cemetery as a cattle pen? Would you not demand they make amends for such disrespect? The parallel was clear and undeniable. Sanders nodded reluctantly, along with several other ranchers. The Apache are not unreasonable people, Ayana said, his tone becoming more diplomatic. We understand that mistakes can be made when people do not communicate properly, but we also believe that those who make mistakes must take responsibility for correcting them. Mayor Hartwell looked around at his constituents, seeing the mixture of guilt and resignation on their faces. What kind of compensation are we talking about? That, said Ayana, will depend on how quickly and completely you address the first 3 requirements. My people value actions more than words. Show us that you respect our sacred places, and we can negotiate fair compensation. Continue to desecrate them. He let the sentence hang unfinished, its implication clear. The crowd murmured among themselves, the weight of the situation finally becoming apparent to all. They had not only insulted a chief's son, but had unwittingly violated some of the most sacred places of the Apache Nation. Sheriff Morrison looked around at the faces of his townspeople, seeing the dawning realization of just how close they might have come to disaster. How long do we have to make things right? Ayana considered this for a moment. My father is a patient man, but the ancestors demand respect. You have until the next full moon, 2 weeks, to begin moving the cattle and cleaning the spring. After that, he shrugged eloquently. The implication was clear to everyone present. The Apache's patience would not last forever, and the consequences of further delay could be severe. As Ayana prepared to mount his horse, Dr. Webb called out, "Will you return to check on our progress?" The small Apache man paused, his hand on his horse's mane. "I will return. And next time, perhaps you will see me more clearly." With that quiet rebuke, he swung onto his horse with fluid grace and rode back toward the desert, leaving behind a town that finally understood the true measure of the man they had so foolishly dismissed. The 2 weeks that followed Ayana's second visit transformed Clearwater Springs in ways no one could have anticipated. What began as reluctant compliance had gradually evolved into something approaching genuine respect and understanding. Sheriff Morrison had organized work crews immediately after Ayana's departure, with Dr. Webb volunteering to oversee the cleanup efforts at the spring. The physician had thrown himself into research about Apache customs and burial practices, determined to ensure they restored the site properly. Mayor Hartwell, swallowing his pride, had written urgent letters to the Territorial Land Office demanding an explanation for how grazing permits had been issued on sacred Apache lands. Buck Sanders, perhaps the most surprising convert among the townspeople, had personally supervised the removal of his cattle from the burial grounds. The experience of walking among the ancient graves, some marked with traditional Apache symbols carved into stone cairns, had profoundly affected the rough rancher. He'd returned to town, pale and shaken, speaking in hushed tones about the sense of desecration he'd felt. "There's bones everywhere," he'd told the other ranchers at Murphy's saloon, his usual bravado completely absent. Not just bones, personal things, pottery, weapons, jewelry, things that meant something to families just like our things mean something to us. What we did, it ain't right. The spring cleanup had proven more challenging than anticipated. Years of cattle trampling had damaged not only the water source, but also surrounding vegetation that held spiritual significance for the Apache. Mrs. Patterson had organized the women of the town to replant native grasses and wildflowers, working from detailed descriptions Dr. Webb had found in his research. As the second week drew to a close, the townspeople found themselves checking the eastern horizon with a different kind of anxiety. They were no longer afraid of Apache retaliation. They were nervous about whether their efforts would meet Ayana's approval. On the morning of the 14th day, just as the sun painted the desert rocks gold and crimson, Ayana appeared again, but this time he was not alone. Riding beside him was Takoda, the powerful young warrior Chief Naalnish had introduced during his intimidating visit. The contrast between the two Apache men was striking. Where Ayana was small and compact, Takoda was tall and muscular, his presence immediately commanding attention. The townspeople gathered quickly, but the atmosphere was markedly different from Ayana's previous visits. There was nervous anticipation rather than mockery, and genuine concern about whether their efforts had been sufficient. Ayana dismounted and walked directly to Sheriff Morrison, who stepped forward to greet him with obvious anxiety. "We've done what we could," Morrison said without preamble. "The cattle have been moved and we've worked to clean up the spring area. Dr. Webb has been leading the effort. He can show you what we've accomplished." Ayana nodded gravely. "I will inspect what has been done. But first I bring someone who wished to see your town for himself." He gestured to his companion. "This is my cousin Takoda, war chief of our warrior society." Takoda dismounted with fluid grace, his imposing presence causing several townspeople to step back instinctively. Unlike Ayana's diplomatic bearing, everything about the tall Apache spoke of danger barely held in check. "My cousin does not speak much English," Ayana continued, "but he understands it well. He came because many of our warriors believe words without actions are like wind without substance." The implication was clear. Takoda was there to verify that the white settlers had actually followed through on their promises, not just offered more empty words. Dr. Webb stepped forward, his medical bag replaced by a leather satchel filled with notes and sketches. "Ayana, I've tried to research the proper restoration methods. I hope we've done right by your people's customs." "Show me," Ayana said simply. The procession that followed was unlike anything Clearwater Springs had ever seen. Ayana and Takoda rode alongside a wagon driven by Dr. Webb, while Sheriff Morrison, Mayor Hartwell, and a dozen other townspeople followed on horseback. The 3-mile journey to Copper Canyon was made in tense silence, with everyone aware that the next hour would determine whether peace or conflict lay ahead. When they reached the spring area, Ayana dismounted and stood quietly for several minutes, his dark eyes taking in every detail. The cattle were gone. That much was immediately obvious. The trampled ground showed signs of careful raking and replanting. Native grasses and wildflowers had been replanted in neat rows, though they were still small and fragile. More importantly, the spring itself ran clear and clean. Dr. Webb's crews had removed debris, cleared clogged channels, and built a small stone wall to prevent future contamination. The burial sites, previously marked only by scattered stones, had been carefully restored with properly stacked cairns. Takoda walked the perimeter of the area, his expression unreadable. He paused at several of the grave sites, examining the restoration work with the eye of someone who understood the proper customs. Occasionally, he would nod or make a quiet comment to Ayana in Apache. Finally, Ayana approached the spring itself and knelt beside the clear water. He cupped some in his hands, smelled it, and tasted it carefully. After a moment, he stood and turned to face the assembled townspeople. "The work you have done shows respect," he said, his voice carrying across the desert air. "The spring runs clean again, and the graves of our ancestors have been properly restored. This is good." The collective sigh of relief from the townspeople was audible. But Ayana wasn't finished. "However," he continued, and everyone tensed again, "respect shown after insult is not the same as respect given freely. You have corrected your mistakes, but you have not yet proven that you understand why those mistakes were made." Mayor Hartwell cleared his throat nervously. What do you mean?" Ayana was quiet for a long moment, seeming to choose his words carefully. "You restored this place because you feared my father's warriors, not because you understood its sacred nature. You listened to my words because you learned who my father is, not because you recognized the wisdom in what I said. This is progress, but it is not yet understanding." Dr. Webb stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. We acted out of fear and political necessity, not genuine respect. But sometimes actions have to come before understanding. Sometimes you have to do the right thing first, and the wisdom comes later." Ayana studied the physician with interest. "Explain your meaning." "I've been reading about your people's customs and history," Webb continued. 2 weeks ago, I didn't know anything about Apache burial practices or treaty rights, but working to restore this place, learning about what it means to your people, it's changed how I see things. The respect we showed in our actions has taught us to feel genuine respect." Takoda spoke quietly to Ayana in Apache, his tone suggesting approval. Ayana nodded and responded briefly before turning back to the townspeople. "My cousin says that a man who admits his ignorance and works to correct it shows more wisdom than one who pretends to know what he does not. He also says—" Ayana paused, and for the first time since his initial visit, his stern expression softened slightly, "that the work done here shows hands guided by genuine care, not just duty." Buck Sanders, who had been standing at the back of the group, stepped forward hesitantly. "Ayana, I want to say something. When I first saw you, I judged you by your size and figured you weren't worth my time. That was wrong, and I'm sorry for it. But I need to tell you, walking through these burial grounds, seeing what my cattle did to your ancestors' resting places, it changed something in me. I got family buried back in Missouri, and if someone treated their graves like that, I'd want blood." The rancher's words, simple and heartfelt, seemed to have a profound effect on both Apache men. Takoda nodded approvingly, while Ayana's expression showed the first genuine warmth any of the townspeople had seen from him. "Your honesty honors both yourself and our ancestors," Ayana replied. "This is the understanding I spoke of, not just knowing what is right, but feeling why it is right." Sheriff Morrison stepped forward. "So where do we go from here? How do we make sure something like this never happens again?" Ayana exchanged another brief conversation in Apache with his cousin before responding. "That, Sheriff Morrison, depends on whether your people are ready to see Apache not as threats to be feared or curiosities to be dismissed, but as neighbors deserving of the same respect you would show any other neighbor." The challenge in his words was clear, but so was the opportunity. For the first time since this conflict began, there was real hope for a lasting peace based on mutual understanding rather than fear. As the group prepared to return to town, Dr. Webb approached Ayana privately. Would you be willing to teach us more about your people's ways? Not just the customs about burial grounds, but your history, your laws, your perspective on the treaties." Ayana considered this for a moment, then glanced at Takoda, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "I will return in 1 week," Ayana said finally. "If your people genuinely wish to learn, I will teach. But remember, wisdom, like respect, cannot be given. It must be earned through open hearts and minds. As the two Apache rode away toward the setting sun, the townspeople of Clearwater Springs found themselves changed in ways they were only beginning to understand. The small man they had once mocked had become their teacher, and the lessons he offered promised to transform not just their relationship with the Apache, but their understanding of themselves. 6 months had passed since Ayana's first humiliating visit to Clearwater Springs, and the transformation of the small frontier town was nothing short of remarkable. What had begun as a crisis born of prejudice and misunderstanding had evolved into something unprecedented in the Arizona Territory, a genuine partnership between Apache and white settlers. The weekly teaching sessions Ayana had promised had become the highlight of many residents' lives. In the schoolhouse where Mrs. Patterson normally taught children their letters, Ayana shared the rich oral traditions of his people, explained the complex network of Apache tribal laws, and helped the townspeople understand the historical context of the treaties that governed their shared land. Dr. Webb had become something of a scholar himself, documenting Apache medicinal practices and learning to see the desert through indigenous eyes. Buck Sanders had surprised everyone by becoming one of Ayana's most dedicated students, his gruff exterior hiding a genuine fascination with Apache horse training techniques and desert survival skills. On this particular autumn morning, as golden leaves from the cottonwoods drifted down around the spring that had once been the source of so much conflict, a delegation of territorial officials rode into Clearwater Springs. Word had reached Tucson about the unusual cooperation between the town and the Apache, and Governor Hughes had sent his representatives to investigate. Sheriff Morrison stood on the boardwalk outside his office, watching the approaching riders with a mixture of pride and apprehension. Leading the delegation was Colonel James Whitney, Territorial Inspector of Indian Affairs, a man whose reputation for harsh dealings with tribal nations was well known throughout Arizona. "Sheriff Morrison," Whitney said curtly as he dismounted, his weathered face stern beneath his military-style hat, "I understand you've been conducting unauthorized negotiations with the Apache." "I'd hardly call them unauthorized," Morrison replied carefully. "We've been working to resolve a legitimate grievance about treaty violations." "That's not your job, Sheriff," Whitney snapped. "Indian affairs are handled through proper territorial channels, not by small-town lawmen playing diplomat." Mayor Hartwell emerged from the bank, flanked by Dr. Webb and several other town leaders. Their expressions showed a united front that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. "Colonel Whitney," Hartwell said with forced courtesy, "perhaps you'd like to see what our unauthorized negotiations have accomplished before you pass judgment." Whitney's aide, a thin man named Pemberton, consulted a sheaf of papers. "According to our reports, you've been allowing Apache access to territorial lands, conducting regular meetings with known warriors, and, most disturbing, permitting Apache influence over local governance." "We've been learning to be better neighbors," Dr. Webb interjected firmly, "and it's been beneficial for everyone involved." "Beneficial?" Whitney scoffed. "Gentlemen, you may think you're being enlightened, but you're being manipulated. These Apache are using your guilt and sympathy to gain advantages they could never win through proper legal channels." As if summoned by the controversy, the sound of approaching hooves drew everyone's attention to the eastern trail. Ayana rode toward town, but he was not alone. Beside him rode Chief Naalnish himself, along with Takoda and 2 other Apache warriors. More significantly, they were accompanied by a white man in an expensive suit, whom none of the townspeople recognized. The group dismounted near the growing crowd, and Ayana approached with his characteristic quiet dignity. 6 months of regular interaction had not diminished his impressive bearing, but the townspeople now recognized the intelligence and authority they had once been too blind to see. "Sheriff Morrison," Ayana said with a slight nod. "Mayor Hartwell. Dr. Webb." He turned to acknowledge the territorial officials. "Colonel Whitney, your reputation precedes you." Whitney's face reddened slightly. "So you're the Apache who's been filling these people's heads with propaganda. I should have known you'd show up once territorial authority arrived." "Actually," said the well-dressed stranger, stepping forward with a slight smile, "I asked him to be here. Allow me to introduce myself. Judge Samuel Harrison, Territorial Circuit Court." The revelation sent a ripple of surprise through both groups. Whitney looked particularly disturbed by this unexpected development. "Judge Harrison," Whitney said stiffly, "I wasn't aware the court had any interest in this matter." "Oh, but I do," Harrison replied, his tone pleasant but firm. You see, I've been investigating the illegal issuance of grazing permits on treaty-protected Apache lands. The Territorial Land Office apparently issued those permits without proper consultation with tribal authorities, in direct violation of federal treaty obligations. Whitney's face went pale. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious crime, Harrison corrected, one that could result in federal charges against territorial officials. He glanced meaningfully at Whitney, particularly those who might have been involved in covering up the violations. Chief Naalnish spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of authority. My son Ayana brought this matter to my attention through proper diplomatic channels. When the local officials showed wisdom by correcting their mistakes, we decided to pursue legal rather than military remedies. Diplomatic channels? Whitney sputtered. This boy couldn't possibly represent Apache interests in any official capacity. The silence that followed was deafening. Every person present, Apache and white alike, understood the magnitude of Whitney's error. He had just repeated the same mistake that had started this entire crisis 6 months earlier. Ayana stepped forward, his small stature somehow seeming to tower over the colonel. When he spoke, his voice carried the full authority of his education, his heritage, and the respect he had earned. Colonel Whitney, I am Ayana, son of Chief Naalnish, graduate of the Santa Fe Academy of Law, appointed representative of the Chiricahua Apache Nation in all matters pertaining to territorial treaty compliance, and currently serving as legal counsel to 3 other Apache tribes in their negotiations with federal authorities. He paused, letting the weight of his credentials sink in before continuing. I speak 7 languages fluently, hold certification in territorial and federal Indian law, and have successfully argued cases before the Territorial Supreme Court. I was personally appointed to my current position by the Apache Council of Chiefs, with the approval of the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs. Whitney's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his face cycling through shades of red and white. But most importantly, Ayana continued, his voice softening slightly, I have learned that true strength comes not from the size of one's body or the volume of one's voice, but from the depth of one's knowledge, the sincerity of one's purpose, and the respect one shows to others, regardless of their race, size, or station in life. Judge Harrison nodded approvingly. Mr. Ayana has been instrumental in exposing the corruption in the Territorial Land Office. His legal research and documentation have been exemplary. Dr. Webb stepped forward, unable to contain his admiration. Colonel, in the past 6 months, Ayana has taught this town more about justice, diplomacy, and simple human decency than we learned in our entire previous history. We're not being manipulated, we're being educated. Buck Sanders, his voice gruff with emotion, added, That man there has more honor in his little finger than most of us have in our whole bodies. We were fools not to see it from the start. Mrs. Patterson nodded vigorously. My students have learned more about American history and the Constitution from Ayana's lessons than from any textbook. He's shown us what this country's ideals actually mean in practice. Whitney looked around at the faces surrounding him, townspeople and Apache standing together, united in their respect for the small man who had once been dismissed as insignificant. The isolation of his position was complete and undeniable. I think there may have been some misunderstanding, Whitney said weakly. Yes, Ayana replied with quiet dignity. There has been. The same misunderstanding that leads people to judge others by their appearance rather than their character, their assumptions rather than their achievements, their prejudices rather than their experience. Chief Naalnish placed a proud hand on his son's shoulder. My son has shown that a man's worth is not measured in inches of height or pounds of muscle, but in the wisdom of his words and the courage of his convictions. Judge Harrison consulted his pocket watch. Colonel Whitney, I believe we have some urgent matters to discuss regarding the Land Office investigation. Perhaps we should return to Tucson immediately. As the chastened territorial officials prepared to depart, Sheriff Morrison approached Ayana with genuine warmth. Thank you, he said simply, for your patience with us, for your wisdom, and for showing us what kind of men we could be if we had the courage to really see each other. Ayana smiled, the first truly carefree smile any of the townspeople had ever seen from him. Sheriff Morrison, the courage was always there. You just needed to learn how to use it. As the sun set over Clearwater Springs that evening, painting the desert sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the town celebrated its transformation. In Murphy's saloon, Apache and white men shared drinks and stories. In the schoolhouse, children of both cultures learned together, and at the spring that had once been a source of conflict, the clear water flowed peacefully over ancient stones, reflecting a future bright with possibility. Ayana stood at the edge of town, preparing to return to his people, when Dr. Webb approached him one final time. "Will you keep coming to teach us?" the physician asked. "For as long as you are willing to learn," Ayana replied. "But remember, the greatest lessons are not the ones I can teach you, but the ones you teach yourselves about looking beyond surfaces to see the truth beneath." As he rode away into the gathering darkness, Ayana carried with him the knowledge that he had accomplished something remarkable. He had not only prevented a war and secured justice for his people, but he had also proven that the true measure of a man lies not in how others see him, but in how he sees himself, and in his courage to demand that the world rise to meet his own standards of dignity and worth. In Clearwater Springs, they would never again make the mistake of judging a book by its cover, or a man by his size, and in the years that followed, the town would become known throughout the territory as a place where justice, understanding, and mutual respect flourished, all because they had finally learned to truly see the extraordinary man they had once dismissed as ordinary.